You had a moment, a breakthrough, an awakening. Maybe it came after months of meditation. Maybe it came after heartbreak. Maybe it came disguised as a breakdown. You saw through it all. The game, the masks, the noise, and then silence. Not a peaceful silence, but a hollow one. The kind that doesn't hum with presence, but hisses with absence. Not depression, not quite, but something you can't name. At first it felt powerful, freeing. You stopped chasing. You stopped pretending. You didn't care what others thought. You didn't even care what you thought. But then that stillness, that sacred pause, turned into fog, and you wondered, why do I feel nothing now that I finally see the truth? We think awakening is the climax, the grand finale, the shining light at the end of our seeking. But Carl Jung, he knew something else. He said, enlightenment doesn't come by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. And that's what happened to you. You didn't just get enlightened, you stepped into the dark cave of your unconscious. And now you're standing there, without a map, without a goal, without a voice telling you what comes next. This isn't the end of your story. This is the unraveling before the rebirth. This is what happens after awakening. Chapter 1. The Psychological Death. When the unconscious becomes conscious, the structures that held your life together begin to dissolve. Your career aspirations feel meaningless. Your calendar feels absurd. Your Instagram goals, your gym progress, your 5-year plan, all of it seems like something a past version of you invented, to distract you from the question that now screams in the silence, what am I actually doing here? Carl Jung called this process the death of the ego identity, the slow, quiet collapse of the story you told yourself about who you were, and why it mattered. You didn't just see through society, you saw through yourself, your image, your roles, your ambitions, and suddenly they lost their gravity, and with it, so did your motivation. But here's the key insight. You didn't lose motivation. You lost egoic fuel, the thing you were burning to keep the mask alive. And without the mask, you're no longer trying to impress, compete, or prove anything. So of course you're tired. Of course you're numb. You've been running your whole life on false urgency. And for the first time, you stopped. It's like this. You've been playing a role on a stage your whole life. Then one day you step off the stage. You drop the script, you look around, and there's no director, no audience, no lines left to say. And in that space, there's just you. Not the version you curated, not the one you edited and filtered for others, but the raw, quiet self. The one that hasn't yet spoken, because until now, you were too busy performing. Carl Jung warned that this death is essential, necessary. It is not a mistake. It is not a malfunction. It is the required sacrifice for the birth of the self. But our culture doesn't tell you that. It tells you that if you're not productive, you're broken. If you're not busy, you're lazy. If you're not happy, you're failing. And so when the stillness comes, you panic, because no one prepared you for this chapter. But this chapter is ancient. It's been written into every myth and mystery tradition. It's the hermit phase, the desert wandering, the 3 days in the tomb. It's the death before resurrection. You didn't do anything wrong. You simply woke up, and now the old operating system doesn't run. This is what happens when the persona dies, and the self has not yet fully emerged. You are not broken. You are in between. And that liminal space, the fog, the numbness, the floating, is not the void. It's the womb. Chapter 2. The void is not failure. So many people hit this moment and think, I'm broken. I've regressed. Maybe I imagined my awakening. Because how could something so true feel so empty? You feel like a light went out, but what really happened is that you left behind a false flame, the kind that flickers constantly up because it was always burning from borrowed energy. And now, there's just silence. Not failure, not depression, but a sacred kind of quiet. Carl Jung knew this space well. He didn't call it a breakdown. He called it a sacred pause, a liminal cocoon, where identity dissolves and something deeper begins to form. But in our world of hyperproductivity and instant clarity, this pause gets mistaken for collapse. for laziness, for paralysis. We're trained to panic in the absence of progress, so when stillness arrives, the ego thinks it's dying, and, in a way, it is. There's a moment in metamorphosis where the caterpillar literally becomes goo, not a caterpillar, not yet a butterfly, just formlessness, and it's messy, unproductive. It doesn't look like transformation. It looks like breakdown, but inside that mess, a new form is being encoded. This is you right now. You're not broken. You're dissolving. And dissolving is not a mistake. It's the sacred precursor to becoming. Jung gave a name to this process, a word few outside deep psychology know, enantiodromia, the swinging of the pendulum into its opposite. The drive of ego flips into the stillness of soul. The obsession with doing becomes the sacred act of not doing. And in that swing, you've experienced the great paradox of awakening, that in order to become whole, you must first become nothing. But here's where the ego panics. It doesn't understand this language. It wants clarity, direction results. It wants checklists, timelines, frameworks. And what you're offering it now is silence, trust, and waiting. So it starts whispering, "You're failing. You're lazy. You've lost it." It will tell you to go back, to hustle, to certainty, to the comfort of the mask. But you can't wear it anymore. It no longer fits. So what now? This is where most modern spirituality skips a step. They tell you to raise your vibration, to follow your bliss, to manifest your dream life. But Jung would say, if you skip the darkness, you skip the gold, because that's where the true work begins, not in the light, but in the shadow. Shadow integration, facing what's been buried, disowned, and repressed. This is the next stage after awakening. Not to ascend, but to descend, into yourself, into the places your ego never wanted to look, the wounds, the fears, the grief. Why? Because now you can see them without flinching, because you have the strength awakening gave you, not to escape your humanity, but to redeem it. Jung said the soul doesn't grow in the light, it grows in the tension, the contradiction, the void. And when you finally stop resisting this in-between, a strange thing begins to happen. Your psyche, so wise, so precise, begins to reorganize. Slowly, imperceptibly, it starts to build a new orientation, not based on fear, not based on chasing, but based on truth. The motivation you once knew, driven by proving, achieving, grasping, will not return. But something else might, something quieter, deeper, older. The self begins to stir, not to fix you, not to make you productive again, but to reorient you toward a life that fits who you are becoming. So if you're floating in this fog, this nothingness, this sacred pause, you're not lost. You're in between. You're in the place where the ego ends and the self begins. And that's exactly where you're supposed to be. Chapter 3. Why the ego panics here. The ego hates stillness, not because it's evil, not because it wants to harm you, but because it doesn't understand. The ego is a tool, built for survival, trained for performance. Its language is doing, its religion is identity, its fuel is control. So when silence falls, when the old motivations fade, when the to-do list no longer stirs you, the ego panics. It thinks something must be wrong. But the only thing that's wrong is that the ego is no longer in charge. We live in a world that worships speed, noise, and clarity. We've been programmed to believe that if we're not producing, we're wasting time. So when awakening throws you into stillness, the default reflex is shame. I should be doing more. I've lost my drive. I need to snap out of this. But here's the truth Carl Jung whispered, and few dared to amplify. Sometimes your psyche stalls you on purpose. It cuts the brakes. It freezes the system. Not as punishment, but as protection. Because if you kept driving on ego-fueled roads, after seeing through the illusion, you'd crash into something you can't yet comprehend. Jung believed in what he called psychic compensation, that the psyche always moves toward balance, and when one part of you has overexerted itself, the other part rises to correct it. So if your ego was the center of your universe for 30 years, the moment it collapses, the self needs to recenter you. But the self doesn't speak in motivation. It doesn't speak in shoulds. It speaks in pause. It speaks in limbo. You went from I must do everything to why do anything. That's not dysfunction. That's enantiodromia, the pendulum flipping into its opposite, and until it finds a new center, a deeper harmony, you will feel lost. But that lostness is sacred, because it's where false maps are burned, and new coordinates emerge. The problem is, no one taught us to honor the pause. No one taught us that motivation can be outgrown, that the fuel we once ran on, status, validation, urgency, can become toxic once the soul starts to awaken, so we resist the quiet. We interpret it as regression, and in doing so, we miss the metamorphosis happening behind the scenes. You're not lazy, you're reprogramming. The self is under construction, and like any sacred reconstruction, it happens underground first, beneath the surface of thoughts and checklists. This is not a detour. This is the path. Jung once said, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. And that includes chasing new goals, joining spiritual bypassing communities, or convincing ourselves that we're fine. But when the ego falls quiet, the self begins to whisper. And at first, those whispers sound like silence, because we're used to screams. The ego is loud. It announces. It demands. The self is quiet. It invites. It waits. This is why the pause feels so disorienting. You've stepped out of an old regime, but haven't yet learned the language of your inner king. And in this in-between, you may feel disconnected. You may feel irrelevant. You may even feel numb. But you are closer to your truth than ever before. Soon, something strange begins to shift. Not a lightning bolt, not a grand reawakening, but a pull. A quiet, inner resonance, a magnetic draw toward things that feel true. Without needing to explain why, you may find yourself drawn to a book, a place, a form of art, a conversation that lights something inside you. That is not randomness. That is the self beginning to guide you. So if you're here, in the thick of the fog, questioning your spark, doubting your direction, know this: your ego didn't fail. It finished its job. And now, the deeper self is taking the wheel. But it drives with stillness, with surrender, with symbolic meaning, not mapped strategy. Your task isn't to rush, it's to listen. Because what's coming next doesn't speak your old language. Chapter 4. The return of a new motivation. Eventually, something shifts, quietly, subtly. No announcement, no fireworks, just a whisper, a pull, a nudge toward something. You wake up one morning and, without knowing why, you feel drawn to pick up the pen again, or paint, or walk a trail you've never walked before, or speak a truth you've never dared say aloud. This is not the return of old ambition. This is the arrival of something else, a new motivation. Not ego-driven, not performative, not for praise or productivity, but a movement from within, rooted in truth. Carl Jung described this as the emergence of the self. Not as a concept, but as a living compass. It's the moment your inner world begins to realign, and the fire that returns is not the anxious blaze of hustle. It's the quiet, steady flame of alignment. You're no longer moved by pressure, you're moved by resonance, by what feels whole. You don't need external validation anymore, because you've met something inside you that is deeper than identity. Something that watches your thoughts, feels your emotions, and guides your actions. Without urgency, without fear. This is the self's motivation. It feels like remembering, not striving. You don't try to create, you have to. Because it would hurt more not to. You don't plan your next step, you follow the thread. You don't pursue passion, you respond to what pulls you. You stop chasing inspiration, and start noticing where it already lives. Jung called this living symbolically, not in fantasy, not in magical thinking, but in soul-powered attention to dreams, synchronicities, images, gut feelings, and the stories that rise up from the unconscious like myths trying to be born. When this shift happens, motivation returns. But it looks unfamiliar. You're no longer trying to build a life that impresses others. You're building a life that expresses your soul, and you realize you were never unmotivated. You were just misaligned. You were trying to write poetry with numbers. You were trying to live from a checklist when your soul speaks in symbols. This new motivation doesn't come with deadlines. It comes with devotion. It's not about how much you can produce. It's about how deeply you can align with what's honest. You may find yourself saying no more often, not out of fear, but out of clarity. You stop betraying your energy just to meet expectations. You stop performing. You start listening. And this is where life begins to feel meaningful again. Not because things make sense, but because they feel true. Jung believed that when the unconscious is integrated, you stop living from the surface of things and start living from the center, from a place below words, below roles, below personality. This is the symbolic life, where your motivation comes not from needing to win, but from needing to live as a soul. You are still human. You will still feel lost sometimes. Fatigue will come. Confusion will visit. But something has changed. You no longer have to pretend. You no longer have to perform motivation. Because when you stop resisting the silence, you discover that it wasn't empty. It was gestating. And now, the voice that returns is your own. So if you're starting to feel a quiet pull toward writing, creating, healing, speaking, walking, listening, don't rush it. Don't label it. Don't try to monetize it, optimize it, or explain it. Just follow it. That is the self. Reclaiming your compass, and what it builds through you will be truer than anything you could have built for applause. Chapter 5. The Symbolic Life Begins. This is where things shift. You're not back to normal. You're not hustling. You're not following a 5-year plan. But something deeper is moving now. You're no longer just existing. You're participating. And this participation doesn't come from discipline. It comes from meaning. It doesn't demand a reason. It offers a resonance. Carl Jung called this way of being the symbolic life. Not a life based in fantasy, but a life rooted in the unseen, the intuitive, the meaningful patterns just beneath the surface of things. You begin to listen to your dreams again. You start noticing patterns in conversations and numbers in nature. You pay attention to the symbols that show up, not as signs to decode, but as threads to follow. Synchronicity becomes your compass, not superstition, not magical thinking, just deep, sacred listening. You stop asking, "What should I do?" and start asking, "What's quietly calling me?" This is not a technique, it's a relationship with your own soul. In the symbolic life, truth isn't always logical. It's not always rational, but it is always alive. Your decisions begin to come from alignment, not performance, from what feels right, not what looks good. And this changes everything. You might still work. You might still build a business, raise children, chase dreams. But now, you're not chasing to be enough. You're expressing what's already whole inside you. You create even if no one's watching. You say no, even if it disappoints someone. You follow curiosity over obligation. Because in the symbolic life, your fuel is not fear. It's truth. You start trusting your gut. You start honoring your boundaries. You don't need to know the whole path. You just need to feel your next yes. Jung believed that the symbolic life was not reserved for mystics or monks. It was the essential missing piece of the modern psyche. The reason so many feel lost even when their lives look successful. Because without a symbolic life, life becomes mechanical, transactional, dry. The symbolic life restores the sacred to the everyday. It re-enchants the mundane. It reminds you that life is not just something to be managed. It is something to be in relationship with. So what does this look like, practically? It looks like asking new questions. Instead of, how can I be more productive? Ask, what feels honest today? Instead of, how can I achieve more? Ask, where is life inviting me to grow? Instead of, what will they think of me? Ask, am I betraying myself? This is the new alignment. It's not always exciting. It's not always fast. It's not always clear. But it's always real. And that's what makes it sustainable. You're no longer burning your life for applause. You're letting it unfold from integrity. In this new paradigm, ambition doesn't disappear. It transforms. It becomes devotion to truth, to presence, to evolution. And the irony is, this kind of energy gets more done than ego ever could, because it's not anxious, it's not fractured, it's coherent. And coherence is power. This new motivation doesn't scream, it hums. It guides you towards service, creation, healing, building. Not because you should, but because your whole being whispers, yes. It's quiet, it's gentle, but it's also non-negotiable. Because once you've lived this way, anything else feels like self-betrayal. So if your old goals no longer fit, if your spark feels strange, if you're creating, resting, or simply existing in a new rhythm, you're not behind, you're not lost. You're living symbolically now. You're building from the inside out. And this is how the self begins to lead. Chapter 6. Becoming the Bridge. You've walked through the silence. You've dissolved in the cocoon. You've waited in the void. You've felt the pull, followed the threads. And now, you're not who you were, but you're not trying to be anyone else either. You are simply becoming. Not in the sense of adding more, but in the sense of revealing what was already true beneath the mask. Carl Jung called this individuation. The sacred process of becoming a whole self, not the small self, not the persona, but the unified being that holds it all. Shadow and light, grief and purpose, chaos and clarity. And once you arrive here, you begin to realize something profound. You are not just awakening for yourself. You are becoming a bridge between the world you were taught to follow, and the world your soul is here to create. A bridge between the seen and unseen, between ego and self, between culture and consciousness. This is where the symbolic life becomes active. Not just something you live, but something you embody for others. You begin to speak differently, act differently, create differently, not from performance, but from coherence. You don't try to convince anymore. You simply express, because what flows from you now comes from a place that cannot be faked. Your spark has returned, but it's not the old fire dash, the ego flame that needed constant fuel, constant affirmation, constant motion. This flame doesn't flicker when the world changes. It doesn't burn out when no one's watching. Because this fire was lit from the core, by the self, and the self doesn't hustle. It waits, it listens, it responds. So what does life look like from here? Not perfect, not constant bliss, but honest. You will still have challenges, but you'll meet them with presence, not panic. You may still feel lost at times, but you'll trust that being lost is part of finding deeper direction. Because you're no longer moving in circles. You're spiraling upward, even if it feels slow, even if it feels quiet. You're evolving in depth now, not just in speed. Carl Jung didn't promise comfort. He promised wholeness. And wholeness doesn't mean feeling good all the time. It means embracing all that you are. Even the parts that once scared you, because once integrated, those parts become your gifts, your compassion, your intuition, your clarity. Now you don't run from your shadows. You know them. Now you don't chase your worth. You embody it. Now you don't follow a map made by others. You walk the path your soul is drawing in real time. And that's what it means to become the bridge. You walk between worlds. You hold space for paradox. You live with both feet in the mystery. Not because you figured it all out, but because you've surrendered the need to. And so here you are, after awakening, after silence, after confusion and collapse. You're not motivated the way you used to be. You're moved now by something deeper, something wiser, something real. You don't chase the moment anymore. You respond to it. You don't dominate life. You participate in it. This is the gift on the other side of awakening. Not clarity that explains everything, but a compass that keeps pointing to truth. So if you've been feeling like your spark disappeared, if you've been sitting in the stillness of wondering what's next, know this: you're not broken. You're not behind. You are becoming. You are being rebuilt from the inside out. And that fire, it never left you. It was only waiting for you to stop performing so it could burn for real. You are not at the end. You are not stuck. You are standing at the threshold of a life that's not driven by fear, but directed by soul. And that is the beginning of everything.